Welcome to The Real Debrief, the show where we dive deep into the world of film production, exploring the genres you love, the projects making waves, and the trends shaping the industry. We're here to give you a 360-degree review for entertainment professionals. So grab your popcorn and get ready for some expert insights. And, well, the occasional bed joke from Talen. It's The Real Debrief. Now your hosts, Talen and Lisa.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. I'm Talen, and as always, I'm here with Lisa. Today's episode is a deep dive into Apple TV Plus's new series, Lady in the Lake, based on the novel by Laura Lippman. This stylish murder mystery is set in 1966 Baltimore and follows two women from very different backgrounds. Maddie Schwartz, played by Natalie Portman, and Cleo Johnson, portrayed by Moses Ingram, whose lives become entangled in a story of ambition, race, and murder. Lisa, to get us started, why don't you tell us about that first pivotal scene where Maddie and Cleo cross paths?
Absolutely, Talen. The first time these two women meet, it's through the display window of a department store. Maddie, a Baltimore housewife, sees Cleo modeling a yellow dress as a living mannequin, and something clicks. Maddie immediately decides she wants that dress, perhaps more than she knows. And while Maddie is focused on acquiring the dress, Cleo's attention is drawn to something else entirely, the blood stain on Maddie's mustard-colored skirt suit. The scene is set in 1966, a year full of social upheaval, but both women are on their own paths toward something larger than themselves. What's so fascinating is how this scene foreshadows the way their lives will intersect in complicated and often dangerous ways.
Right, and that window between them is so symbolic. It reflects not only their social differences, but also how they're both trapped in their circumstances, even as they look at each other. Maddie is this affluent white housewife, and Cleo is a black woman trying to navigate the criminal underground while caring for her children. Yet both are striving for more in a world that's not made for them to succeed easily. They're both on the cusp of political gatherings that are supposed to represent social change. Maddie for a Jewish civil liberties fundraiser, Cleo for a rally supporting Maryland's first black woman state senator. But there's this sense that no political movement can fulfill either woman's personal ambitions or inner desires.
Exactly. The series makes it clear early on that these women's personal struggles are intertwined with the larger social issues of the time. Second-wave feminism, desegregation, Jewish assimilation, but their ambitions go beyond these movements. They're personal. Maddie, for example, soon leaves her husband and teenage son to pursue a career in journalism. It's a bold move, but it's not driven solely by a desire to break free from societal expectations. She's driven by something deeper. A desire for personal recognition, for something more than the life she was expected to lead. And then there's Cleo, who's also striving for more, but from a completely different starting point. She's already entrenched in the underworld, working as a bookkeeper for Shell Gordon, a local gangster. But her dreams are surprisingly modest. She just wants a legitimate job where she can help people like herself, even though the world isn't designed to help her.
Now, what's so interesting about Lady in the Lake is how it uses these characters' personal stories to tackle larger social issues. Maddie's decision to leave her family and pursue a career in journalism feels very much like a feminist awakening, and she's a classic case of what Betty Friedan calls the problem with no name, where housewives were unfulfilled despite living the so-called American dream. But at the same time, Maddie's ambition comes off as selfish at times. There's a scene where her son, Seth, accuses her of abandoning him and calls her out for being more concerned with her own career than her family's well-being. I mean, how do you see Maddie's ambition fitting into the feminist narrative of the time?
Maddie is a fascinating character because she embodies both the strengths and the flaws of second-wave feminism. On one hand, her desire to break free from the confines of domestic life and pursue her own dreams is a core tenet of the feminist movement in the 1960s. But on the other hand, Maddie's ambition is deeply personal and sometimes callous. She doesn't seem to fully grasp the consequences of her actions, especially when it comes to her son. Seth tells her, "You think every story is your story," which is such a telling line. Maddie is so consumed by her desire for something more that she overlooks how her actions affect those around her.
Oh, yeah. And that's such an important point. In many ways, Maddie represents the darker side of ambition. I mean, what happens when personal drive overshadows empathy and responsibility? She wants to be seen, to be heard, but at what cost? There's even a moment where she calls her son selfish for being upset by her departure. It's a harsh exchange, but it speaks to how much Maddie's desires have left her emotionally distant from the people who are supposed to mean the most to her.
Absolutely. And while Maddie's ambition is rooted in a desire for personal fulfillment, Cleo's story is grounded in survival. Cleo is raising children, working multiple jobs, and trying to carve out a life for herself in a world that offers her very few opportunities. She's ambitious, too, but her ambitions are so much more practical than Maddie's. Cleo isn't dreaming of a glamorous career, she just wants stability, a way to provide for her family without relying on the criminal underworld. But despite keeping her dreams small, Cleo's path becomes just as treacherous as Maddie's, if not more so.
So, Cleo's journey in Lady in the Lake is one of the most compelling parts of the series, in my opinion. From the start, she's positioned as a foil to Maddie. But as the show progresses, she becomes much more than that. Cleo's character is complex. She's fiercely protective of her children, loyal to her friends, and willing to do whatever it takes to survive. But she's also trapped in a world of predators, men like Shell Gordon, who promises her a better life but continually exploits her.
Cleo's story is one of resilience, but it's also a story of exploitation. She works for Shell, a man who positions himself as a kind of benefactor to the Black community in Baltimore. But it quickly becomes clear that his promises of empowerment are hollow. Shell is just another predator, using his power to manipulate and control people like Cleo. There's a particularly poignant scene where Cleo is talking to a local prophet who tells her that the best way to help her sick son is to tithe to his church. It's such a heartbreaking moment because Cleo is desperate for help, but everywhere she turns, she's met people who want something from her in return.
Oh yeah, that scene really stood out to me too. Cleo is a woman who has sacrificed so much for her family, but no matter how hard she tries, the world keeps taking from her. I mean, it's a stark contrast to Maddie, whose ambition, while flawed, allows her to pursue her dreams without the same level of danger or exploitation. I mean, Cleo doesn't have that luxury. She's constantly putting herself at risk, whether it's through her work for Shell or her involvement in the criminal underworld. And it eventually leads to her being deemed disposable by the very people she thought she could rely on.
Exactly. Cleo's journey is a reminder of how limited the options were for Black women in 1960s America. Even when she tries to do the right thing, to provide for her children through legitimate means, the system is stacked against her. And that's what makes her such a compelling character. She's not just a foil to Maddie, she's a fully realized person with her own hopes, fears, and ambitions. Cleo wants more from life, but she's forced to navigate a world that offers her very few chances for escape.
All right, now let's talk about how race plays into these women's stories. One of the key tensions in Lady in the Lake is how Maddie's whiteness affords her opportunities that Cleo doesn't have. There's a scene where Maddie is investigating the murder of Tessie Durst, a white girl whose death has garnered significant media attention, and Cleo's exasperated widower warns her, "You don't know whose floor you're dancing on." It's a powerful line because it speaks to Maddie's privilege. She's able to insert herself into this community without fully understanding the risk that people like Cleo face every day.
That's such an important scene, Talen. Maddie is so focused on telling the right story, on being the voice for people who she believes need her help, but she doesn't realize that her actions have real consequences for the people she's writing about. Cleo, on the other hand, knows exactly what those risks are. She's lived them. For Maddie, investigating Tessie's murder is a career move, a way to prove herself as a serious journalist. But for Cleo and the other residents of the neighborhood, it's a matter of survival. They can't afford to have someone like Maddie stirring up trouble without understanding the dynamics at play.
Exactly. There's a sense that Maddie is using these stories for her own gain without fully considering the impact on the people she's writing about. And this dynamic is particularly evident in the way the series contrasts the attention given to Tessie Durst, the young white girl, and the lack of attention surrounding Cleo's struggles or even the murder of a black woman like Shirley Parker. While Maddie is easily able to investigate Tessie's case with full access to interviews and information, Cleo and the other black characters in this series are relegated to the margins. This disparity highlights the racial biases that permeate not only Maddie's journalism, but also the broader social system of the time.
That's spot on, Talen. Maddie's investigation into Tessie's murder becomes a symbol of the ways in which white narratives were, and still are, prioritized over black ones. Tessie's death, while tragic, gains widespread attention and sympathy, but Cleo's life is seen as disposable, not worthy of the same attention. What's so powerful about Lady in the Lake is that it forces Maddie, and the audience, to confront these uncomfortable truths about privilege, race, and whose stories get told.
Yeah, another fascinating aspect of Lady in the Lake is how it delves into the moral complexities of ambition. Maddie, in her pursuit of a career, often makes decisions that come across as morally ambiguous, if not outright unethical. For example, there's a point in the series where she seems more interested in using Tessie's murder for a sensational story rather than seeking justice for the victim. And then there's Cleo, whose ambitions are also fraught with moral compromises, but they're driven by survival rather than personal gain. So my question is, how do you think the series handles these moral complexities, Lisa?
The series does a great job of exploring the gray areas of ambition, especially through its two protagonists. Maddie is desperate to carve out a new life for herself, but she often doesn't consider the consequences of her actions on others. Her investigation into Tessie's murder, for example, leads her to interview the suspect, Stephen, who has violent tendencies and a troubled past. Maddie's interest in him seems more about creating a compelling narrative than understanding the truth. Her sense of morality is often clouded by her ambition, which is what makes her such a compelling, though not always likable, character. On the other hand, Cleo's moral compromises are driven by necessity. She doesn't have the luxury of pursuing a dream for personal fulfillment. She's navigating a dangerous world where her survival and the well-being of her children are at stake. Even when she makes questionable choices like working for Shell or getting involved in criminal activities, we understand that she's doing what she feels she has to in order to protect her family. The contrast between Maddie's and Cleo's motivations adds a lot of depth to the series' exploration of ambition and morality.
Oh yeah, exactly. Maddie's privilege allows her to pursue ambition almost as a form of self-actualization, while Cleo's ambition is born out of survival and necessity. And that's where we see the biggest difference between the two characters. For Maddie, it's about crafting her own narrative, her second act, as Cleo so poignantly points out in a voiceover. Your writing dreams ruined your life. Now you want those same dreams to rewrite it? Cleo's resentment is palpable, and for good reason. She's become a supporting character in Maddie's story, her life and death another chapter in Maddie's search for meaning. It's a painful reminder of how the ambitions of the privileged can overshadow the lives of those who don't have the same opportunities.
That's such a powerful line, Talen, and it speaks to the broader theme of how power and privilege shape whose stories get told and who gets to tell them. Maddie's ability to reinvent herself, to step into the world of journalism and take control of her narrative is a privilege Cleo doesn't have. And this dynamic is mirrored in the other aspects of the show as well. particularly when it comes to identity. Maddie is a Jewish woman, and while she faces her own challenges, particularly in relation to assimilation and the anti-Semitism of the time, she is still able to wield a certain level of power because of her race and social status. Cleo, on the other hand, is a Black woman who's been systematically excluded from those same opportunities.
That's a great point. I mean, the series doesn't shy away from exploring the complexities of identity and how they intersect with power. Maddie's Jewishness, for example, is an important aspect of her character, but it's not portrayed in a monolithic way. She's navigating a society that's becoming increasingly hostile to Jewish people, but she's also benefiting from the privileges of being white in a segregated city. I mean, there's a scene where she attends a political fundraiser for Jewish civil liberties, but it's clear that even within that space, her concerns are largely self-centered. It's this interesting push and pull where she's both marginalized and privileged at the same time.
And that's what makes Maddie such an interesting, albeit flawed, character. She's constantly grappling with her own identity and her place in the world, but she's not always aware of the ways in which her privilege allows her to navigate spaces that would be closed off to someone like Cleo. It's a reminder that identity is multifaceted and that the same person can experience both oppression and privilege, often at the same time. Cleo, meanwhile, is navigating a world that offers her no such ambivalence. Her identity as a Black woman is constantly a source of danger and marginalization, and the stakes for her are so much higher.
All right, I also wanted to touch on how the male characters fit into this world. Lady in the Lake is primarily about the struggles of women. Maddie and Cleo are the focus. But the men in their lives play crucial roles in shaping their journeys. Maddie's estranged husband, her son, Seth, and Cleo's boss, Shell, all have significant impacts on the women's stories, whether through direct action or the social expectations they represent. So, how do you think this series handles the male characters, Lisa?
The men in Lady in the Lake are fascinating because, while they're not the central focus, they serve as representations of the broader societal structures that both enable and constrain Maddie and Cleo. Maddie's husband, for example, is a traditional figure. He's the breadwinner, the provider, and when Maddie leaves him, it's seen as a radical, almost selfish act. But his role in Maddie's life is important because it highlights the societal expectation that a woman's primary role is as a wife and mother. The fact that Maddie can't sell her own car without his signature, despite it being registered in her name, is a stark reminder of the legal and social constraints women faced in the 1960s.
Oh yeah, that moment really stood out to me. I mean, it's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the control men had over women's autonomy during that time. And then there's Seth, Maddie's teenage son, who is grappling with his own feelings of abandonment. His relationship with Maddie is fraught, and while he's angry with her for leaving, you also get this sense that he's like mourning the loss of the traditional family structure he's always known. I mean, he represents the next generation caught between the changing roles of women and the expectations of the past.
And then there's Shell, who plays a huge role in Cleo's life. He's both a benefactor and a predator. On the surface, he presents himself as someone who's empowering the Black community in Baltimore. But as the series progresses, it becomes clear that he's using his power to exploit and control the people around him. Cleo is caught in this web. She works for Shell, but she's also trapped by him. Her relationship with Shell is a reminder of how the systems of power in society, particularly those dominated by men, often offer false promises of protection or advancement to women, only to exploit them in the end.
Yeah, it's a complex dynamic. And it speaks to the broader themes of control and autonomy in the series, whether it's through legal, familial, or criminal systems. I mean, the men in Lady in the Lake hold a significant amount of power over the women's lives. But at the same time, the series doesn't position them as the ultimate villains. It's more about how the larger social structures play out through individual relationships. All right, and as we get closer to wrapping up, I want to talk about the mystery element of the series. At its core, Lady in the Lake is a murder mystery. But, it's not your typical whodunit. The focus isn't necessarily on solving the crime, but on exploring the lives of the people affected by it. So, Lisa, how do you think the series balances the mystery with its more character-driven elements?
The mystery in Lady in the Lake is definitely a driving force, but like you said, it's not the sole focus. The show is more interested in how the murders, first Tessie's and later Cleo's, affect the people around them, particularly Maddie. The investigation into Tessie's murder is what propels Maddie into journalism, but as the series progresses, it becomes clear that the mystery itself is secondary to the broader themes of power, privilege, and identity. Tessie's murder, and later Cleo's, serve as entry points into a deeper exploration of Baltimore's racial and social tensions in the 1960s. Maddie's investigation feels personal, not because she's trying to seek justice, but because she's trying to build her own narrative, her second act, as Cleo pointed out. The real mystery, in a way, isn't about who killed Tessie or Cleo, but about who gets to tell their stories and what the cost of that storytelling is.
Oh, that is so true. The mystery becomes almost identical to the character arcs and the social commentary. And what's fascinating is that Maddie's investigation into Tessie's murder isn't met with the same resistance as her attempts to look into Cleo's life. Tessie's story is easier for Maddie to sell. It's palatable for the broader, mostly white audience. But Cleo's death? That's a story no one's rushing to read about. The series really hammers home the idea that justice is often selective, tied to whose lives are deemed valuable or newsworthy.
Exactly, Talen. And I think that speaks to the structural inequalities the show is critiquing. Maddie comes to this epiphany late in the series, that stories like Cleo's are harder to tell, and not because they're less important, but because they challenge the dominant narrative that society is comfortable with. Cleo's murder is harder to solve, not because it's more complex, but because society doesn't care enough to investigate thoroughly. That's the real tragedy of the series. The lack of attention given to lives that don't fit into the mainstream mold of whose stories matter.
Yeah, it's such a sobering realization, and it really makes you think about how crime and justice are often portrayed in the media, both in real life and in fiction. This isn't a show that ties everything up neatly with a big revelation at the end. There's ambiguity, and that's intentional. We're left questioning not just who committed the crime, but how society allowed these crimes to happen in the first place. And in a way, that ambiguity is more powerful than any definitive answer could be.
Absolutely. The show's decision to leave certain elements unresolved feels true to the characters and the world they inhabit. Maddie's journey isn't about finding justice for Tessie or Cleo. It's about coming to terms with the role she plays in this broader system of inequality. By the end of the series, Maddie is forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that her ambition, her desire to tell these stories, has consequences that go beyond her own personal fulfillment.
All right, so before we wrap things up, we have to talk about the aesthetic and the atmosphere of Lady in the Lake. The 1960s setting, the fashion, the music, the visuals, it all plays such a significant role in shaping the mood of the series. So, Lisa, what stood out to you about how the show captured the time period?
The attention to detail in Lady in the Lake is one of the things that makes the show so compelling. From the department store scenes to the political rallies, the series immerses you in 1960s Baltimore in a way that feels both nostalgic and unsettling. The vibrant colors, the mod fashion, and the swinging 60s aesthetic all give the show a stylish, almost dreamlike quality. But underneath that surface, there's this constant sense of unease, especially for characters like Cleo, who are fighting to survive in a world that's glamorized on the outside, but harsh and unforgiving underneath.
I totally agree. The series uses its period setting not just as a backdrop, but as a way to highlight the social dynamics at play. There's a clear parallel between the shifting social movements of the time, second-wave feminism, desegregation, civil rights, and the personal struggles of the characters. The fashion, the decor, the music all serves as a reminder of the changes happening in the world, but they also emphasize how much hasn't changed for women like Cleo and even Maddie, who are still trying to break free from the roles they've been assigned.
Exactly. And I loved how these scenes use oniric, dreamlike sequences to heighten that sense of dissonance. There's a particularly haunting scene where Maddie is talking to Tessie, the child murder victim, in a dream, and Maddie tells her, "You're old news." It's such a chilling moment because it speaks to the fleeting nature of attention in the media, how stories and the people they're about are quickly forgotten once the next headline comes along. It's another way the show critiques not just the period it's set in, but our contemporary culture as well.
Oh yeah, that dream sequence stuck with me too. It's one of those moments that feels like a throwback to shows like The Sopranos or Mad Men, where the lines between reality and dreams blur, giving us a deeper insight into the character's psyche. Maddie is constantly grappling with her own relevance, her desire to be seen, to be heard. And that scene with Tessie is almost like her subconscious reminding her that even the most sensational stories fade over time. It's a reminder of how fleeting both fame and justice can be. All right, as we come to a close, I think it's worth reflecting on what Lady in the Lake has to say about our current moment. It's a period piece, yes, but so many of the issues it tackles, racial inequality, privilege, the media's role in shaping narratives, they all feel incredibly relevant today. So, what do you think, Lisa? How does this show resonate with the world we're living in now?
You're absolutely right, Talen. Although Lady in the Lake is set in the 1960s, the themes it explores are very much alive today. We're still grappling with the same questions about whose stories get told, whose lives are valued, and how race, gender, and privilege play into the narratives we create. The way the series portrays Maddie's ability to tell Tessie's story, while Cleo's life goes largely unnoticed, is a stark reminder of the racial and social biases that continue to shape our media landscape. Even today, we see how certain stories dominate the news cycle while others are ignored, often depending on the race, gender, or social status of the people involved.
Oh yeah, that's so true. And I think one of the strengths of Lady in the Lake is how it forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths. We can't just watch Maddie's story unfold without questioning her motivations, her privilege, and the consequences of her actions. The show asks us to think critically about the stories we consume and the ones we choose to ignore. And in doing so, it also reminds us that justice, whether it's in the form of a solved murder or a well-told story, isn't always as straightforward as we'd like to believe.
Exactly. Lady in the Lake is a murder mystery, but it's also a meditation on power, privilege, and the complexities of storytelling. It's a show that asks difficult questions and doesn't provide easy answers, which is what makes it so engaging. And while it's set in the past, its messages are deeply relevant to the present. We're still living in a world where certain voices are amplified while others are silenced, and Lady in the Lake challenges us to reflect on our own role in that dynamic.
Well said, Lisa. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Lady in the Lake is not just a stylish murder mystery, it's a thought-provoking examination of the power dynamics that shape our world, both then and now. Thanks so much for your insights, Lisa. It's awesome. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you, Talen. And to our listeners, if you haven't checked out Lady in the Lake yet, we highly recommend it. There's a lot to unpack, and it's one of those shows that will stick with you long after the credits roll.
Definitely. We'll catch you next time on the podcast. And as always, we invite you to continue the conversation with us on social media. Let us know what you thought of Lady in the Lake and what other shows or films you'd like us to dive into next.
Thanks again, everyone. See you next time.
This has been The Real Debrief. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, like, rate, and review. We'll see you soon on The Real Debrief.